Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Monday Night Lecture Series. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. My name is Lorie Karnath, and I had the honor to serve as the Explorers Club president for 3 terms. Today, I'm heading a charity that I helped found called Next Breath. This organization works to improve the air quality that children breathe around the world. And cleaner, more breathable air is what brings us to our guest speaker tonight. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Edwards. David is a scientist, inventor, and writer, and was a professor of the practice of bioengineering at Harvard University through 2019. In that year, he founded Century Cloud in Cambridge, Massachusetts. David has pioneered the science and technology of aerosolized drugs, vaccines, and respiratory hygiene innovation. Among his many contributions in this realm is the new respiratory health salt product known as FEND. In addition, David's research has led to the founding of the future food company called Incredible Foods. Besides his textbooks in applied mathematics, David has written several books on creativity and the creative process, and he has won many US and international awards, including the Time Magazine Best Invention Award in 2014 and again in 2020. His new hygiene protocol, based on the natural functions of the body, was also listed by Fast Company as an idea that will change the world. Welcome, David.
Thank you so much, Lorie. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So we're talking about air. COVID-19 has triggered a new focus on the air that surrounds us. So what have we learned from all this?
Yes, it has. And we've learned a lot. Actually, there's both scientists have learned a lot and learned a lot that only a few scientists knew prior to the pandemic, and also discovered a lot during the pandemic. And then, of course, the public has learned a lot. So there's a number of learnings that have happened here. And one of the consequences that we understand a lot better how we breathe and how we become infected through airborne infection, and also how we transmit infection. And maybe really briefly, I'll say that when the pandemic began, there was a general impression in the scientific community that SARS-CoV-2, the virus responsible for COVID-19, would primarily transmit through the large droplets that you might see with the strobe light when someone coughs. And that was the general understanding of how airborne transmission occurred prior to around 2000, largely because we couldn't really see the smaller particles. It became clear and leading to a letter, as probably most people know, in July by a number of aerosol scientists to the WHO, an open letter, that these very little droplets that we call respiratory droplets that are created in the airways when we naturally breathe and when we speak and other respiratory maneuvers, these droplets, which are generally much larger, much smaller than 1 micron, and therefore move through and around masks, most masks, are the primary vector for transmission. And that has been eventually acknowledged by the CDC and the WHO, but it's taken time. We've also learned a lot about where those droplets come from, where anatomically they come from, also why they vary between one person and the next, or in your lungs and my lungs in the course of a day, a week, and the year. So there's a lot that's been learned.
Yeah, I agree. So can you tell us a little about FEND and how it came to be, and how does it work?
So just to backtrack a moment, my career began, as you mentioned, in applied math, and I had the fortune of meeting Bob Langer at MIT in the late 90s and published a paper in Science related to inhaled insulin and delivery, sort of weaponizing of insulin to deliver it to the lungs in a very simple way. And so when the anthrax scare happened in 2001, I was invited to Washington, D.C. to help the government understand how to prevent anyone from weaponizing anything. And it led to an observation in the early 2000s in a publication in PNAS that we made, that if you place salt water, and as probably everybody knows, you're airways, your lungs, your body actually contains salts, and these are largely salts that are in the ocean for reasons that I can describe. You actually reduce dramatically the number of these respiratory droplets that are generated, and so we published this and developed it to some degree to answer the question, what is FEND? What happened when the pandemic began in March of last year? I brought some of the publications and a lot of the work that had not been published in the 2000s when this issue became less of a concern by 2010 to the FDA with Bob Langer and Janet Woodcock, who leads the drug division, and with a proposal. And the proposal was that should we deliver these salts through the nose, and your audience may not understand or know that when you deliver salts through the nose, which has been done for centuries and centuries, the FDA regulates that, depending on how you talk about it, as a cosmetic, as a cleanser, kind of like soap. And so it would allow us to actually get right into humans. And so our supposition was that we probably could have a really big impact on respiratory droplet generation simply by a nasal salt that was designed with particles that would land right here in your trachea and main bronchi where these droplets form. Anyway, we got into the clinic and have now since then done 6 human studies and the 7th ongoing right now. FEND came out in the late last year. It's a product that looks like this. Actually, it maybe doesn't look like a product that you develop for COVID-19. And in fact, we rushed a lot of the work that we were doing in olfactory science and technology to market with FEND so that we could help people in the pandemic. And the product has been selling since late last year. There's about 10,000 people using the product around the country, but we've mostly been using it to understand how what we call now airway hygiene works and have done a lot of human trials with it. So that's briefly then, FEND is a new hygiene. It's the equivalent of washing the hands for gastrointestinal disease, but for washing the airways or cleaning the airways for respiratory disease.
Thank you. So you spoke a little bit about your studies, and I know that there's been ongoing studies in India where there's been a very high level of virus. So I'm just wondering if there's anything you could tell us about those findings so far.
Yeah, absolutely. So for everyone's sake, there's obviously, when it comes to infectious disease, a few ways that we protect ourselves. There's a hygienic approach, there's a drug approach, and there's a vaccine approach. And what may not be known is that the real fundamentals of hygiene, which go back a very, very long time, of course, but modern hygiene and washing of hands particularly really goes back to this Civil War period, at least here in the United States. And the first ivory soap came out right after the Civil War. So it was a major disaster, human disaster, really, the Civil War, that led us to sort of discover that hand hygiene, even though it's not a drug, could actually save lives in the surgeries that were so widespread during the Civil War. So we're in a similar situation where a lot of hygiene innovation has happened here, in addition to drug and vaccine innovation. And so what we've been focusing on is the hygiene. And so indeed, when the pandemic hit hard a year ago in India, we were invited to by the Azim Premji Foundation to work with medical staff at Bangalore Baptist Hospital and explore whether airborne salts, nasal salts, which you may all know have been used for a very, very long time in India, but now again designed with high calcium content and with droplet size to get to this upper airway region, whether we could have an impact on cleaning the airways. And so we published some work actually in your journal late in the year, Molecular Frontiers journal, showing that it's very effective. But what happened, Lorie, is that in the winter we were doing a study in COVID-19 patients in Bangalore, and when the Delta variant began to spread as rapidly as it did, the decision was made to begin to treat incoming patients. So a randomized control study with a nasal saline control was started in the February timeframe. we're just now submitting for publication the research, and so I'll just very high level describe what we found. Remarkably, we found that treating 3 times a day administration of this salt has a significant impact on lowering symptoms and also raising oxygen pressure in the blood, which is a measure of your lungs' ability to bring oxygen into your blood, and also reduces IV steroid and antibiotic use relative to the control. So we're very hopeful that a really simple intervention, which of course salt and water is everywhere, could be very impactful, and particularly in those populations like in India today that may not have immediate access or maybe even ever access to vaccines.
So thank you. So this goes, from what I understand, beyond the virus, however. Is that clear? It also works against other pathogens. Poor air quality, as you know, is still the #1 killer, or is and probably will be in the developing world. So
your audience may understand that the intuition and to some degree data over the centuries has led people to expose themselves to high salt concentrations for a very long time, not just for airborne infection, but also for chronic respiratory diseases, particularly in Europe in the 19th century as industrialization began to dirty the air and respiratory diseases became preponderant. It was noticed in some places that those who were not getting respiratory disease were actually salt mine workers. And so the modern therapy of halotherapy, which is bringing those with chronic respiratory disease into salt environments, was developed. So we're learning a lot more, and without getting into too much detail here, we do know now that the main function of salt in your upper airways is to hydrate your upper airways. That's really critical. Your audience may understand that the dry environment is really bad for not only COVID-19, but also for asthma and COPD and other respiratory diseases. Any disease that is provoked by particulate matter getting deep in the airways is one that can be helped by your upper airways cleaning the particles better, and that happens when they're better hydrated. So yes, the rationale for airway hygiene it relates to respiratory disease quite generally, both airborne infectious diseases and chronic respiratory diseases, which is, as you're alluding to, Lorie, have been rising really dramatically here for the last couple decades.
It's true, yeah. So one of the reasons why I really wanted to get you, interview you for the Explorers Club is I was thinking about some of the things that you said from the point of exploration. And I know in some of your talks, you often speak of our sensory disequilibrium with our environment and its relation to our air and why this harms human health and eventually harms our relationship with nature. So one of the goals with exploration is that when we go into the field, we want to leave no trace. But clearly, unless we can control our exhalation, we're indeed leaving a trace. If you think about it over the course of history, there's been many examples of explorers exploring new territories where unintentionally they brought disease to indigenous populations. This is still the case through today. So how do we prevent this?
Yes, absolutely. So to just reiterate for everybody's sake that if we could reduce respiratory droplet exhalation and frankly inhalation, we would eliminate the primary vector for transmission of airborne infectious disease. So really independently a variant or airborne infectious disease. So now let me just take a step back and say that with regard to our senses and what has made me really fascinated by the air, not only does the air we breathe bring into our bodies particulate matter that could be carcinogenic or allergenic or pathogenic, but also brings in to our airways molecules that stimulate our olfactory system. And the olfactory nerve is the only sensory nerve that goes straight to the brain. Most of the olfactants that are stimulating and shaping our cravings and our food addictions and passions for food are actually coming from our mouth through the air into our olfactory bulb. And so the air is bringing into our bodies with every breath we take signals that are actually radically different than they were 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. And consequences to that are twofold. One is to us and the other is to nature. With us, cardiovascular disease has risen dramatically. A lot of the signals that have come to us through the industrialization of food are olfactory signals in the air. Respiratory disease, number one killer in the developing world, is almost becoming the number one killer in the developed world. At the pace things are going, 9 out of 10 people are breathing polluted air, and other signals that are disrupting sleep and worker wellness all relate to the air and the air we breathe. So you could say, Lorie, that we're in a situation where we are almost at war with the environment around us, and it goes two ways. So my argument is that our survival on the planet, long before we had an FDA or food guidelines or understood the idea of air pollution, has been an intuitive sensorial one. And so we've been dependent on nature and coexisted and survived with nature. And the importance of reestablishing that equilibrium with nature is really critical, not only for us, but for nature around us. Particularly in exploration, as you mentioned, and we've talked a lot, Lorie, about in coming into a virgin natural environment. It's arguably most critical that the exhaled aerosol cloud around us is not bringing infectious organisms that could be infecting the environment around us. And we may also, of course, be receiving infection from the nature that, of course, has been the predominant mode of infectious disease transmission over the last several hundred years. So the rationale for airway hygiene, and indeed when we bring FEND out this September, it will be in a form factor that looks like this. I actually have it around my neck right now for the Explorers Club here, just to sort of illustrate how this works. It's a very simple, inexpensive device. There's no preservative. It's only salt and water. There's no batteries. There's no metal. You squeeze it, and there's a cloud that comes out. You can see that. This is just in salt mist, droplets just right to land right here. You breathe in, you spray it in your nose, breathe really deeply, and you do that twice every 6 hours. And the consequence is that the number of respiratory droplets you're exhaling are 75% on average lower for several hours. And the benefit, again, is both to the natural environment around you and your vulnerability to the natural environment.
I believe this is a particularly important tool for exploration, especially in view of what we've experienced with this pandemic. And as we know, there are certainly more pandemics that have the potential to arise. I think for anyone who is out in the field, it's a consideration that we have to take into account.
Yes, I think honestly, I'm hopeful. You know, obviously this is just a horrible crisis that we're going through right now, and it's unfair. I'm hopeful that we're learning to think differently about the air we breathe, and recognizing that the air we breathe we're sharing with everyone else and with nature. And so I mentioned the hand washing transformation of hygiene back in the 19th century. I'm hopeful that coming out of the pandemic, we will just think differently about hygiene, and it will become an intuitive act to clean our airways as regularly as we brush our teeth or wash our hands. I think we need, Lorie, to move from the fear and worry and cognitive recognition that we're harming nature, and to a point where we're just naturally doing the intuitive kind of logical thing.
I agree. So I'd really like to thank you, David, for your time today and for this important message on how we can, especially as explorers, best protect nature. And so I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. I'd like to also thank Ann Passer, Kevin Murphy, Richard Garriott, Will Roseman, Louis Muga, and Alex Serrano, and all the other Explorers Club staff who have helped make this program possible tonight. And we are looking forward to taking your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorie.
Ready. David, we have a number of questions asking to see the product, and if you could just explain and show us how it works.
Absolutely. FEND currently looks like this. It's a product that we, as I mentioned, rushed to the market at the end of last year. You tip it over and it creates a cloud of mist. And when you tip it over and breathe it through your nose, a deep nasal inhalation, you do that twice. There's about 100 doses in a single device. The device that will be launching in pre-launch in August and be available from September 1 on is this device, and it can be hung by a lanyard around your neck. It will cost $14, and you squeeze it and it sprays, and it has 100 doses in it. And once again, you just spray it at your nose, and there's the deep inhalation that lands the salt aerosol on your trachea and your main bronchi.
Okay, thank you. So now one of the questions is relating to the variants. You spoke about COVID, but do you have any information on how effective this is against variants? Or
yeah, well, again, it's helpful to think about hand washing as an analogy. The benefit of hand washing is it's really effective against any kind of bacterial or viral gastrointestinal infection, and the same thing is true for airway hygiene. We are particularly we have been for the last 9 months doing studies in India, in Bangalore Baptist Hospital, and are just in the process of submitting an article on a study that we began in December and just now concluded in COVID-19 patients, 87 patients. And what's interesting about the study is that we began the study where the Delta variant was just beginning to spread. And by May, the predominant infection sequenced in Bangalore was the Delta infection. And so it's very interesting to see both the effectiveness of the FEND intervention. And so we looked at a 3 times a day administration to those who are coming into the hospital with a COVID-19 positive infection and are not yet in need of oxygen. And both without divulging the results, it's effective relative to a control. It's a randomized two-arm study. But what's also really interesting is that you see the different signature in the aerosol spread from the variant that was preponderant in December to the Delta variant in June. And the Delta variant is many more times aerosolizable. So there's much more aerosol in the air with the Delta variant. So bottom line, the benefit of a hygiene intervention is that it's really agnostic to not only the variant, but also the type of pathogen.
So what you're saying, does that indicate why the variants are so more contagious? Or?
Yeah, I think there may be many reasons why it's more contagious, but one of the reasons that's implicated by this study is that the virus and viruses generally emit surfactants, and surfactants coat surfaces like mucous surfaces, and the addition of surfactants causes mucous surfaces to break up more easily. which is something we've shown in multiple studies. And so what's very likely happening, and it may be one of many things going on with the variant, is as new mutations occur, and they have different surfactant signatures. Those that are breaking up the mucous surface more effectively, inevitably, are more able to spread than those that don't. So you can understand why a mutation like the Delta variant would suddenly become the predominant variant. It's just getting more in the air. Now, there may be other aspects of the mutation that are at play, but that from this study seems to be true as well.
Thank you. Now, here's a question from Cynthia, who talks about the long COVID as one of the most tragic parts of this pandemic. And so she's asking, do you think this could help with prevent post-viral illness?
A great question. And I think that we don't know enough about what the causes are of long COVID, but just to point out a couple things. In our work with Chad Roy, who leads the aerobiology group at Tulane, and we published an article with him a couple months ago, where he, among a few labs in the world, had been looking at in a large animal model, have been looking at COVID-19 and long-term residence of a virus, and so it's likely that virus remains in certain tissues, and so one of the benefits of the hygiene in that regard is it's whatever the viral particle, or frankly, it could be a carcinogen or an allergen that is in the upper airways. It is limiting the traffic of that contaminant deeper in the lungs. And so any symptoms that are associated with deeper lung infection, not necessarily COVID-19 infection, but obviously pneumonia and other kinds of lung infections, would be benefited by this airway hygiene. I should also point out that one of the, as your audience probably understands, the olfactory nerve is the only sensory nerve that has a direct link to the brain, and so there's just two synapses between the olfactory receptor and the hippocampus, and therefore some of the effects that we've read a lot about, maybe some of the audience has experienced, is a loss of the sense of smell and therefore a flavor perception. And that effect could be modulated by nasal delivery, but frankly, that's a pathway to neurological effects that really go beyond just an airway hygiene intervention.
Okay, thank you. And assuming someone has the vaccine, that does not necessarily take care of the issue of exhaling the virus. Is that correct? I mean,
yeah. And so because the vaccines on the market today are not mucosal vaccines, we're not immunizing through the mucosal surfaces. So one of the strategies for future vaccines is to deliver the vaccine in the airways, which would, if effective, produce a mucosal immunity. So I think that's the long-term direction. In the short-term direction, we can all be vaccinated, and the virus can still land in our airways and live in our airways. And so, to your point, Lorie, you can be a host. That also, to the degree that you're susceptible to breakthrough infection, you being a host of the infection is not going to help your chances of avoiding that. So in general, having airway hygiene before, during, and after infection is both protective of your own lungs, but also those around you.
okay, thank you. Here's a question from Deborah, and she asks, is the salt that you speak of, is it just regular salt?
Well, in a way, it's regular salts. So these are salts that are in your body, and so they're also in the ocean, and so they're everywhere. They have a ratio and a composition that have been designed and that we've sort of discovered works. So to be really clear, the two salts in the solution are sodium chloride, that's table salt, and calcium chloride, that's not table salt, but it's something that you could find. And again, the ocean has quite a bit of. The salts that are especially effective, and we've shown why that's true. I'd be happy to talk about that, are what we call divalent cations. And so calcium and magnesium chloride, they're both in the lungs. We deliver these salts to the lungs at a higher concentration than anyone has delivered to date. To be clear, the salinity of the solution is more or less the salinity of the ocean. So this is not it's a salinity that the body is used to receiving. And the calcium exposure, if you will, is similar to what you would get from a magnesium salt if you were near the Dead Sea.
Okay, thank you. This is somewhat related in that this person is asking if water can build up fluids, inhaling water can build up fluid in the lungs, which is a medical problem, and inhaling salty water can irritate the airways in people with asthma. Can you talk about these risks?
Yeah, absolutely. So to be clear, our airways, from our lower airways to our upper airways, are coated with water and salt. And so just a little quick lesson on what happens when you breathe air in general. Beyond your carina, so you have your mouth, your larynx then opens up into the trachea, which then branches into the main bronchi, and from that point down, all the air is 100% saturated with moisture. So when you breathe pretty much any air, the water in your upper airways is actually evaporating and moisturizing the incoming air. And that's really essential to our survival, honestly. So water's coming out of the upper airways, and then particles are coming onto the upper airways. So there's this constant water evaporation, and the way that the upper airways bring water into the airways to make up for the water that they've lost is through salt. So when water evaporates in your upper airways, it concentrates the salts that are there, and that pulls water out of the epithelial cells by osmosis. So in general, water and salt is really critical, and why it's important to have salt exposure. And I should just point out, wherever people are today, they're breathing salt and water and moisture in the air. So the planet and our environment is the air in our environment is full of sea salt, and that's just because 2/3 of the planet is covered with sea, and so the salt that is highly concentrated near the seaside is actually, that salt goes up into the atmosphere and ends up coming back onto Earth. So pretty much wherever you are, you've got some salt that you're breathing in. Now, it's true that there are some conditions now where delivering salt deep in the lungs may or may not be a good strategy. As maybe the person who's asking the question knows, salts are delivered deep in the lungs for all kinds of respiratory conditions, including cystic fibrosis. But what's also important to understand is that we're not doing that. So we're delivering the salts only to the nose and the very upper airways. And that's exactly where the airways need salt and actually accumulate salt to keep themselves hydrated. Last thing I want to say is that dry air and evaporation of moisture, and therefore indeed high salt concentrations, tends to be a very bad thing for the airways and ends up promoting particle movement deeper in the lungs. And so the hydrating of the upper airways through salts and water is quite critical to upper respiratory health and ultimately lower respiratory health.
Okay, thank you. Here's a couple questions fairly similar, and you've in part answered them, but because several people are asking, I'm going to ask you anyway. So they want to know if Epsom salts are good for bathing or anything else, and what about salty steam bath? Are either of those?
Yeah, so I can't really comment on pretty much anything that relates to getting salts in your airways. I will take those questions, and so I'll just focus for the moment on the steam bath with salts. So, and I don't recall if we mentioned this earlier in the program, but the exposure of those with respiratory, particularly chronic respiratory illnesses, to humid, salty environments has a very long history. it goes back to, frankly, Roman times, but it definitely became a practice in the 19th century in Europe, and now is quite common. So steam with salt it can be good. It really depends on what else is in the atmosphere. So one of the benefits of the caves or halotherapy kind of environments is that you pretty much have no allergens. There's no mold, and it's just water and salt, which is a good thing. Once you get to a very humid environment, you can have mold and you can have other things that are carried in the droplets. So steam baths might be a bad thing. Really depends on what else is in the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So because this is geared towards explorers, I have an explorer question here. So as explorers, we do and will travel the world. Is there any possibility of FEND being used in airlines that transport us around the world and deliver us to wilderness places where we don't want to introduce pathogens?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that from September, our effort will be to get these little objects in every seat in every airline. So using this before you get into the plane or on a long trip, taking it twice. If everyone did that, you would lower, based on the data to date in hundreds of human subjects, you would lower the aerosol that's in the atmosphere by 75% and have a really significant impact on the probability of infection, not just COVID-19. Particularly for those of you who are going into a virgin natural environment, it's quite essential to be sure that your air is as clean as it possibly can be of respiratory droplets. So even if you may be breathing out germs that will not infect you because your body has a natural immunity to it, you are all aware of the fact that that may not be true in nature. So the better than a mask when it comes to these little droplets, just getting rid of those little droplets is a very smart thing.
Okay. Thank you. So here's a question on how long can you be a host of a virus or carry it in your nasal passage?
Well, it depends on your immune system, but in general, it depends on the virus. But in general, when it comes to COVID-19, a typical time course of exposure, proliferation, and elimination would be about 1 to 2 weeks. And so the number of 10 days has been focused on because that's kind of what it ends up to be. And what happens in that success scenario is that you'll see a growth in viral proliferation in the upper airways and the nose from day 1 up to day 4 or 5, could be 6. And then your immune system begins to eliminate it. Part of that elimination is the mucus clearing pathogen to the mouth, which is what FEND helps mucus do, and then you're clear of infection. But if your immune system is weak, the virus could stay for a much longer period of time, and that's when your probability of really severe symptoms goes up. And the audience probably understands this, but the severe symptoms of COVID-19 is true of many, if not most, respiratory diseases, is when the contaminant, the allergen or the pathogen, gets deep in the lungs because your lower airways are not made. They're really made to absorb oxygen. They're really not made to pick up these dangerous particles. And the longer you have a pathogen in your upper airways, the more likely that is to happen.
Okay, thank you. Here's a question you'll find interesting. This is from Scott. He says, because FEND is a particle agnostic, does this imply that there are broad indications which FEND can potentially serve, i.e. all respiratory?
Yeah, well, I like to make the soap analogy often because it's familiar and we're all comfortable with soap today. But the audience probably understands that back in the middle 19th century, nobody really thought about using soap as a daily hygiene, particularly to avoid infections. And the Civil War came, and it was found that having soap in soldiers' bags helped them survive, and therefore the first ivory soap came out after the war. But data matters. So what I'm going to say is just based upon what we know, and also what science makes us believe, and then just to say that time needs to play out here. We've already learned so much here in the last year. So in general, respiratory droplets will carry anything that is a contaminant that you breathe into your lungs. So let me make it clear that depending on where you live, you are breathing in between 100 million and 10 billion particles a day. And of course, our ancestors sat in caves and burned fires and breathed a lot of particles. And so your lungs are prepared for that. The way they handle that is that most of those particles you breathe in, again, carcinogens, allergens, pathogens, and other things, fall out in your upper airways, your nose, your mouth, and this part of your, what we call the conducting or the gas exchange regions of your lungs. And so you have a mucus that captures those particles, and if everything's working right, sweeps those particles within several hours to your mouth, where you swallow them, and they're eliminated. And that's how the natural mask sort of works. Anything that would provoke COPD, asthma, RSV, pneumonia, by penetrating deeper in the lungs will benefit by not getting into the air from the mucus and actually being just swept out through the mouth. So we believe, and I'll share a little bit of data here, that airway hygiene, just like washing the hands, is broadly as beneficial to the prevention of respiratory disease as hand washing is beneficial to the prevention of gastrointestinal disease. Now, you can wash your hands every day and still get a stomach infection, and so it's not a silver bullet, but it almost certainly lowers the probability of getting an infection. And I think it will be true for COPD and asthma and all of the diseases many of the diseases we've seen growing at alarming rates here over the last few decades. What do we know? So we have 2 papers that we'll be publishing here later this summer. One, which is demonstrating that the hygiene, the salt delivery to the upper airways, is producing this cleaning of the airways, very similar to what happens in a humid room, or frankly, what happens when you put on a mask. So this hydrating of the upper airways can be done by putting in water or putting in salt, and they both kind of work hand in hand. What's different about FEND is that it lasts much longer, and that's the calcium and the magnesium effect. And so you can breathe it into your upper airways, and it will clean the airways for 4 to 6 hours, whereas a humid room or walking near the sea will just help you for about an hour after you leave that. And so now I say all of that because there's quite a bit that's been learned here in the last several years about the benefits of hydrating the upper airways for asthma, for COPD, and for other particularly infectious respiratory diseases. And then the only really concrete data we have right now are on both influenza and COVID-19.
Okay, great. Thank you. This one is in from Ali from Ireland, and she's asking, should we be more alkaline? And what's the absolute best way to do this? Is it through something like FEND?
Well, the pH of our solution is a physiological pH. There are some benefits to an acidic pH in terms of preventing microbial growth, but because of our system is sterile, we only have water and salt, and there's no need for preservative. The pH is just physiological pH. There are some benefits or uses of varying salinity or alkalinity, if you will, but we don't do that. We're really just focused on the salt effect. Is this the absolute best way? I think you ask any scientist, anything the absolute best way. Presumably there's always a better way. And so what we've learned over the last 20 years is that the reason why a calcium, so a hypertonic calcium or magnesium salt, works best, given what we know. And I would say that the Dead Sea is probably a good is a good parallel. So if you're near the Dead Sea, that's probably a good option. Is that it has this longer term cleansing effect, and it has to do with the interaction of calcium and magnesium with anionic surfactants and mucin molecules. But they're also in the body. And so it's not like you couldn't use other kinds of molecules, and you could, but then there's the issue of clearance. And so we're just putting into the physiological milieu what's already there.
Okay, thank you. So here's a question on where are some of the worst types of airborne pathogens? Where are some of the biggest concentrations around the world?
Well, I think that this is it's a great question. So it depends a little bit on who you are, and it depends. In other words, some of us would be more at risk than others. I should also just point out that when it comes to defining the risk of a pathogen, there's both the risk that if I get infected, might I die, and some infections are extremely mortal, and then Ebola, for example, and then there's other pathogens that are not so risky. COVID is one, but extremely contagious. And honestly, as we've seen here, if you could sort of identify the worst case, it would be a pathogen that is as dangerous to our health as COVID-19, not only with the risk of mortality, but also with the longer term effects. It mutates very rapidly and is extremely contagious. So I would say that today, the worst place to be is in a very polluted air environment where vaccination against COVID-19 has not been widely adopted. And there's some obvious places right now, and unfortunately, Southeast Asia is really suffering, and in some places in South America. I think that it's reasonable to assume that later this fall we'll probably have another visit of the pandemic. I don't suspect that it will be like what we've been through, but watching closely what's going on in India, I think that there's unfortunately a little bit more to come here.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the it seems like one of the positive things about this product is this is something you can take anywhere, anytime. You can protect yourself wherever you are. It's something naturally to your body. So here's one of the more practical questions from this evening. Someone's asking, where can this be purchased?
So you were leading me down a road there that I was walking along, but let me just say that the place to purchase this is hellofenn.com. And the product that you can purchase today is this product. By August, we'll be selling pre-selling the pocket version, and then distributing it in September. hellofenn.com.
Okay, thank you. And I want to first of all thank everybody who tuned in tonight from all over the world. We greatly appreciate it. And I want to thank you, Professor Edwards, for your time. David, it's been great. And I want to remind everybody who's watching from the Explorers Club that next week is going to be the GLEX event in Portugal. So you'll be receiving a link for that. And you will be given a code to sign into the GLEX event. But in the meantime, for all of those who are traveling, you might consider taking your friend along with you and protecting each other and protecting our wildlife. So thank you again, David.
Thank you so much, Lorie. Thank you all. It's really fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.